Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum students. We continue our discussion on the topic of antibiotics. Now we discuss classification of antibiotics. Students, antibiotics are classified on three bases. Number one, on the basis of mode of action. Antibiotics are classified on three bases. Number one, on the basis of mode of action. Number two, on the basis of spectrum of activity. And number third, on the basis of mechanism of action. These are three different criterions for the classification of antibiotics. Number one, on the basis of mode of action, antibiotics may be bacteriostatic antibiotics and bactericidal antibiotics. Students, bacteriostatic antibiotics are those antibiotics which stops the replication cycle of microorganisms, that is bacteria. Okay, bacteriostatic antibiotics, they stop the replication cycle or growth of bacteria. These antibiotics include tetracyclines, erythromycin, lincomycin and chloramphenicol. These are the examples of bacteriostatic antibiotics. Now, bactericidal antibiotics. As the name indicates, bactericidal antibiotics are those antibiotics which kills the microorganisms, that is bacteria. Okay, cidal means killing. These antibiotics include cephalosporins, penicillins, aminoglycosides, cotrimazole. Okay students, so we have completed the classification on the basis of mode of action. Now, classification on the basis of spectrum of activity. That is, number one, broad spectrum antibiotics. Students, broad spectrum antibiotics are those antibiotics which are effective against a wide range of bacteria. For example, we can say that a combination of amoxicillin and clavulanic acid present with the brand name of Calamox or Augmentin. These are broad spectrum antibiotics. Why? Because they act against majority of gram-positive bacteria and some gram-negative bacteria. Similarly, broad-spectrum antibiotics, they include amoxicillins, cephalosporins, tetracyclines and erythromycins. Short-spectrum antibiotics. Students, short-spectrum antibiotics are those antibiotics which are effective against very limited range of bacteria. For example, some antibiotics are effective against only gram-positive bacteria. Some antibiotics are specific only against thermophilic bacteria. Some antibiotics are effective only against mesophile bacteria. So short spectrum antibiotics include penicillin G, vancomycin and fluoxetines. Now student, third basis, on the basis of mechanism of action. This classification on the basis of mechanism of action, it is present in my separate video lecture which I delivered on the antibiotics discussing mechanism of action. I shortly repeat, antibiotics having classification on the mechanism of action. For example, number 1, cell wall synthesis inhibiting antibiotics. Those antibiotics which inhibit the cell wall of bacteria. Number 2, protein synthesis inhibiting antibiotics. These are the antibiotics which prevent the synthesis of proteins in the bacteria. Thirdly, folic acid synthesis inhibitors or folate antagonist antibiotics. For example, cotribexazole, they inhibit the formation of folic acid in the bacteria. Number 4, DNA gyrase inhibitor antibiotics. These antibiotics, they prevent the enzyme DNA gyrase, and this DNA gyrase enzyme is essential for DNA and RNA synthesis. Next is RNA synthesis inhibiting antibiotics, DNA synthesis inhibiting antibiotics. So this basis of mechanism of action of antibiotics, it is present in my separate video lecture. You may consult from there. And students, thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.